There is a very specific type of loneliness that you can only experience on the open highway late at night. When you are traveling across the country, the world outside your window seems to shrink down to nothing more than the small stretch of asphalt illuminated by your headlights. For a 17-year-old growing up in Georgia, this quiet, nocturnal world was not intimidating at all. In fact, it was highly alluring. This teenager wanted nothing more than to follow in their father's footsteps and become a professional long-haul truck driver. They already had plans to get their commercial driver's license, commonly known as a CDL, the very second they turned 18, to help them gain some crucial hands-on experience and see what the trucking lifestyle was really like. Their father agreed to let them tag along on a routine delivery run up to North Carolina. The trip started out like any other haul. The drive from Georgia was relatively short and straightforward, taking them just a single day to reach their destination. However, their scheduled delivery at the warehouse was not set until early the next morning, sometime around midnight or 1 o'clock. Since they arrived in the area with several hours to spare, the father decided the best course of action was to pull their massive semi-truck into a highway rest area so they could both get some rest before the hectic delivery window opened. This particular rest area was massive, and the parking lot was completely packed with rows of idling semi-trucks. The quiet, rhythmic hum of diesel engines filled the air, but otherwise the area was completely silent. Almost every single driver was asleep in their sleeper berths, resting up for their own early morning journeys. As soon as they parked, the teenager's father went straight to sleep in the back of the cab, but the teenager was a natural night owl. They stayed awake in the passenger seat, scrolling on their phone and watching the quiet, empty pavement outside. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the teenager realized they needed to use the restroom. They also decided to bring along their personal straight razor. They had been meaning to line up their mustache, a meticulous grooming task they usually only did in the comfort of their own home. They figured that since it was so late, the rest area bathroom would be completely abandoned, allowing them to take their time in front of the mirrors without anyone else around to bother them. They climbed down from the tall truck cab and walked through the cool night air toward the brick restroom facility. The building was designed with 2 separate wings, one on the left and one on the right. When the teenager pushed open the heavy outer door, they decided to head into the left wing. But the moment they stepped inside, they realized they were not as alone as they had hoped. Standing near the urinals was a man. He was incredibly tall, easily 6 feet 4 inches, with a well-kept beard and clean, normal clothes. He did not look homeless, and he did not appear to be under the influence of drugs. He was just standing there, completely still, staring at the wall. The teenager tried to ignore the strange vibe and walked past him, entering a stall to use the bathroom. While inside the stall, the teenager kept listening, expecting to hear the man leave. But there was only silence. When they finally came out to wash their hands, the tall man was still standing in the exact same spot, completely motionless. The teenager felt a sudden wave of intense discomfort. They turned toward the exit, and just as they were about to push the door open to leave, the man suddenly unzipped his pants and began using the urinal. It felt completely fake, as if he only did it to make it look like he had a legitimate reason for standing there so long. Wanting to avoid this creepy individual entirely, the teenager decided not to go back to the truck just yet. Instead, they walked over to the right side of the restroom building, assuming the man would stay on the left. They stood in front of the large mirror, took out their razor, and began carefully lining up their mustache. But barely 10 seconds passed before the heavy outer door creaked open once again. Through the reflection in the mirror, the teenager watched in horror as the exact same tall man walked into the right wing of the restroom. A cold dread settled in the teenager's stomach. There was absolutely no logical reason for this man to leave the left side and follow them to the empty right side. The man began walking directly toward them. But the moment the teenager raised the sharp, metallic razor to their face, the man suddenly froze in his tracks right behind them. The tall man looked completely shocked, almost as if he had expected the teenager to be completely defenseless and caught off guard. The sight of the sharp blade in the teenager's hand seemed to completely ruin whatever plan he had. The teenager tried to keep their breathing steady, continuing to trim their mustache while watching the man's every move through the glass. The man then slowly walked over to a nearby urinal and once again pretended to unzip his pants, but he wasn't actually using the restroom. Through the mirror, the teenager could see the man staring directly at them with wide, unblinking eyes. The man gave a slow, deliberate nod. The teenager, desperate to keep the situation from escalating, nodded back. A few seconds later, the man walked into an empty toilet stall and closed the door. But he didn't lock it, and he didn't sit down. When the teenager glanced back through the wide vertical gap in the stall door, they saw the man standing completely still in the corner, his eyes wide and locked entirely onto the teenager. It was a deeply predatory, unnatural sight. The teenager quickly finished up, folded the razor back into their hand, and kept their grip tight, ready to defend themselves if the man lunged. As they walked toward the exit, they had to walk directly past the man, who had stepped back out of the stall. The teenager pushed through the heavy doors and burst out into the night, feeling an immense wave of relief. They noticed several security cameras mounted near the entrance, which gave them some comfort. The tall man did not follow them outside. The teenager ran back to the safety of the truck, where their father was still fast asleep. Still shaken, they messaged a friend and explained the entire terrifying encounter. 20 minutes later, the friend replied, suggesting they go back to the restroom while on a FaceTime call so the friend could see the layout and make sure the guy was gone. For some reason, the teenager agreed. They walked back to the brick building with their phone held up, but the restroom was now completely empty. The tall man had vanished. As they stepped back outside, they noticed a separate, smaller parking lot located behind the rest area, specifically meant for passenger cars. There was only one vehicle parked there, a red sedan with its headlights shining brightly into the darkness. But the very second the teenager turned their head to look at the car, the headlights were abruptly switched off. The teenager couldn't see who was inside the car due to the darkness, but the timing was incredibly unsettling. Had the tall man been waiting in that car? Were they watching the teenager the entire time? The teenager quickly ran back to the safety of the truck cab. They never told their father about the incident because he was very strict and would have stopped letting them go out alone. But they still wonder what would have happened if they hadn't been holding that sharp, straight razor in their hand. Now let us move to a completely different location, the massive, chaotic, and often unpredictable environment of New York City. For a young woman in her early 20s, navigating the complex transit system of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, or the MTA, was simply a routine part of daily life. She had lived in the city her entire life, so riding the subways and buses at all hours of the day and night was second nature to her. Her daily commute from her college campus back to her home was a grueling 2-hour journey each way. It required her to take 2 different trains, catch a 30-minute bus ride, and then complete a final 5-block walk down a dimly lit residential street. After years of repeating this exact routine, she rarely thought twice about her personal safety. But there are 2 specific nights that she still replays in her mind, over and over again. The first incident occurred on a crowded subway train during the evening rush hour. She had just managed to squeeze through the sliding metal doors right before they closed, so she remained standing near the exit, holding onto the vertical metal pole. She had her headphones in, listening to music, when she faintly heard a voice speaking in her direction. She looked over and saw a homeless man standing nearby, muttering to himself. At first she tried to ignore it, assuming he was just talking to himself, which is a very common occurrence on the subway. But then she realized his eyes were locked entirely on her. She pulled out one of her earbuds and asked him what he had said. Immediately, the man erupted into a face of pure anger, shouting a barrage of deeply personal and aggressive insults directly at her. The sudden, unprovoked hostility made her heart instantly start pounding against her chest. She felt a wave of heat rush to her ears and face as all the blood surged to her skin. In a state of quiet panic, she began looking around the train car, desperately trying to make eye contact with any of the other passengers. She was silently begging for someone, anyone, to acknowledge what was happening and stand up for her. But every single person in the car immediately looked away, staring at the floor or their phones, refusing to hold her gaze for even a second. When the train finally screeched to a halt at the next station, even though it was not her stop, she quickly stepped off the train and hurried down the platform. She slipped into the next car over, hoping the aggressive man wouldn't notice where she had gone. As the train started moving again, she kept glancing through the window connecting the cars, holding her breath in fear that he would appear. It wasn't until 2 stops later that she finally saw him step off the train and disappear into the crowd. The second incident occurred a few years later while she was attending graduate school. Her night classes didn't finish until 8:30 in the evening, which meant by the time she caught the bus back to her neighborhood, it was well after 10 o'clock. Late-night bus rides always felt different. They were much quieter, darker, and far more unpredictable. On this particular night, she was listening to a true crime podcast about a woman who was being actively followed home. The suspenseful story made her hyper-aware of her surroundings, so when she finally stepped off the bus, she turned down the volume of her headphones. The final leg of her journey required her to walk past a series of small commercial stores before turning onto her dark, quiet, dead-end residential street, which was notorious for having terrible street lighting. As she walked, she passed a local Popeyes restaurant. She briefly debated whether she should go inside to buy some mac and cheese, but she decided against it and kept walking. However, by the time she reached the end of the block, she changed her mind and turned around to head back to the restaurant. The moment she turned around, she noticed a man who had gotten off the same bus. He had been walking a short distance behind her, but the second she changed her direction, he froze completely. He stood there on the sidewalk, staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. It was a deeply unnatural reaction that immediately made her stomach knot with anxiety. Trying to brush off the bad feeling, she walked into the Popeyes anyway. Because it was so late, the restaurant was almost completely out of food, so she walked back out after less than a minute and continued her walk home. But as she neared the entrance of her dark residential street, she saw him again. The man was standing directly at the corner, right where the streetlights ended and the darkness began. He was simply waiting there, watching the path she had to take. Her walking pace slowed to a crawl. Sensing immediate danger, she quickly pulled out her phone and called her brother. Her brother was rarely home at that hour, so when he answered on the first ring, it felt like an absolute miracle. He must have heard the sheer terror in her voice, because the moment she told him she was standing near the Popeyes, he immediately told her that he was leaving the house right now to come meet her. Knowing her brother was on his way gave her the courage to turn down the dark street. As she walked past the waiting man, she heard the heavy sound of footsteps immediately start behind her. The man had matched her pace, staying just a few steps back. In a quiet, chilling voice, he muttered that he loved her, followed by a series of low, incomprehensible whispers. Terrified of being cornered in the dark, she decided it was safer to get back to a well-lit area. She turned around and walked back toward the commercial stores, stopping outside a brightly lit liquor store. Since she had lived in the neighborhood for years, she hoped to see some of the local men who usually hung out nearby, but on this night, the sidewalk was filled with strangers. Suddenly, the man closed the distance and approached her. He began repeatedly asking if she needed help, insisting that he could guide her home, while slowly stepping closer and closer. She loudly and firmly said no several times, but he refused to back away. It was then that she noticed a bizarre detail. The man was wearing blue latex gloves. This was long after the pandemic had ended, and it was a warm night, so there was absolutely no logical reason for him to be wearing protective gloves. Furthermore, he wasn't wearing a face mask, which made the gloves look even more out of place. It looked as though he was prepared to grab someone, without leaving any physical evidence behind. The man began pressuring her, repeatedly telling her that she needed to go home, almost as if he was trying to force her back into the dark street where he had been waiting. A few seconds later, he turned and walked into the liquor store. Seizing the opportunity, she turned the corner and saw her brother walking quickly toward her. The entire ordeal had lasted only 5 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Our final story takes us to a relatively large, historic city in southern Europe. A 19-year-old university student lived in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood consisting of small houses and modern residential buildings. It was a very safe area, entirely free of sketchy alleys or abandoned properties. The student knew almost all of their neighbors personally, so they had never felt a single moment of fear while walking home. At 19, their life was highly structured and repetitive. They spent their days attending lectures, returning home to study for upcoming exams, sleeping, and repeating the cycle. They had very little free time, but on one particular Friday, their parents announced they were traveling to another city to visit relatives for the weekend. They would be gone until Sunday afternoon, meaning the student would have the entire house to themselves. For a young college student who enjoyed quiet alone time, this was an exciting opportunity. They decided to invite their group of friends over for Saturday evening to order food, play video games, and catch up. But before the weekend could begin, the student had a commitment on Friday night. Their university was hosting its annual geography quiz, and they had promised their peers they would participate. The event took place in the large student hall, which was packed to the brim with 10 different teams. The atmosphere was lively, with free food and drinks provided for everyone. To the students' delight, their team of 6 performed incredibly well, securing second place in the competition. After taking photos and celebrating, the student hurried to catch the last subway train of the night, as the city's transit system did not run 24 hours a day. They got off at their local station and began the brief 10-minute walk back to their house. It was early October, and a chilly wind was blowing through the empty streets. The student was exhausted, looking forward to nothing more than eating some hot microwave noodles and falling asleep in their warm bed. But as they walked down the silent street, the quiet was suddenly shattered by one of the loudest, most blood-curdling screams they had ever heard in their life. It was the voice of a man, and he sounded as if he was experiencing unimaginable physical agony, like having a limb severed. The students stopped dead in their tracks, their heart leaping into their throat. They looked around, but the street was completely dark, with almost every house having its lights turned off. A heavy, suffocating silence settled back over the neighborhood. But then, a second agonizing scream pierced the night. This time the student was able to pinpoint the direction of the sound. It was coming from the exact path leading to their own house. Walking as quickly as possible without outright running, the student kept their head on a swivel, constantly looking over their shoulder and listening for any movement in the dark shadows. As they rounded the final corner near their home, they saw a group of 4 or 5 figures standing in the distance, about 200 yards away. The moment the group spotted the student, they immediately began sprinting directly toward them, shouting loud, unintelligible words. The students' survival instincts took over. They bolted toward their front door, which was thankfully much closer to them than the charging group. As they reached the porch, their hands shook so violently that they dropped their keys onto the concrete floor. In a panic, they scooped up the keys, glanced back, and saw the group closing the distance. The pursuers looked dirty and disheveled, wearing ripped, heavily soiled clothes. The student managed to thrust the key into the lock, turn it, slip inside, and slam the door shut, locking it instantly. They stood in the dark hallway breathing heavily, terrified that the men would try to break the door down. But outside, the street fell completely silent once again. After waiting a few minutes in the darkness, the student crept over to the windows to peer outside, but the street was entirely empty. They decided to call the emergency services at 112 to report the chase and the terrifying screams. Unfortunately, the operator was not very helpful, repeatedly asking if the student knew the attackers and explaining that since no physical harm had occurred, there was little the police could do. However, she promised to send a patrol car to monitor the area. 20 minutes later, the student watched from the window as a police car slowly patrolled past their house. Feeling slightly safer, the exhausted student finally went to bed. The next day, the student tried to put the horror behind them. One of their friends had called in sick. so it was just the student and their best friend hanging out at the house all day. The student briefly mentioned the encounter to their friend, who was genuinely concerned, but tried to laugh it off to keep the mood light. Before going to sleep on Saturday night, the student meticulously checked every lock on the doors and windows. They turned on a movie to distract themselves, but about an hour in, they heard a loud, violent bang against the outside of the house, as if someone had thrown a heavy rock at the walls. They turned off the television and sat in absolute silence, waiting to see if anyone would try to break in. The fear slowly began to mix with a sense of intense anger. The students stayed awake, keeping watch from their second-floor bedroom window until 4 o'clock in the morning, when exhaustion finally took over and they fell asleep. The next morning, they were awoken by the sound of their parents returning home. After helping them with their bags, the student sat them down and explained everything that had transpired over the last 48 hours. Their parents were deeply shaken and immediately arranged to have security cameras installed around the entire perimeter of the property. To this day, the student has no idea who those men were, why they chased them, or who had been screaming in the dark. Was the screaming man a genuine victim, or was it a calculated trap to lure unsuspecting neighbors out of their homes so they could be robbed or worse? The mystery remains entirely unsolved, leaving behind a lingering sense of dread that never truly went away. Looking back on all three of these incidents, it is incredibly clear how quickly a normal, everyday routine can turn into a battle for survival. Whether you are a young student walking home in Southern Europe, a graduate student commuting through the busy streets of New York City, or a teenager trying to learn the ropes of truck driving at a highway rest stop in North Carolina, danger can appear when you least expect it. In each of these situations, the victims had to rely entirely on their instincts, their quick thinking, and in some cases, simple luck to escape completely unharmed. When we examine the rest stop incident, we have to ask ourselves what the tall man's true intentions were. Rest areas are notorious for being hotspots of criminal activity because they are easily accessible from major highways, allowing predators to quickly flee the scene after committing a crime. The fact that the man followed the teenager from one side of the facility to the other, blocked their path, and watched them through the gaps in the stall door suggests he was actively looking for an opportunity to strike. It was only the sudden, unexpected appearance of the straight razor that forced him to hesitate, giving the teenager the precious seconds they needed to finish and leave. The red car waiting in the dark with its headlights turning off only adds to the theory that this was a coordinated effort, perhaps with an accomplice waiting outside to facilitate a quick escape. In the case of the New York City commuter, the danger was just as real, but it took on a much more psychological form. The subway system and the city streets can be incredibly isolating, even when surrounded by hundreds of people. When the young woman was being harassed on the train, the silence of her fellow passengers was a stark reminder of the bystander effect, where individuals are less likely to offer help to a victim when other people are present. This isolation became physical when she was followed down the dark residential street. The man wearing latex gloves on a warm night is perhaps the most chilling detail of her story. Latex gloves are not worn for warmth, and since this was after the height of the pandemic, they were not being used for casual hygiene. They are used to prevent leaving fingerprints, suggesting a pre-planned, malicious intent to grab or assault someone. Had her brother not answered the phone and rushed to meet her, she would have been completely alone with a man who was actively closing the distance and ignoring her loud, repeated demands to be left alone. Finally, the incident in Southern Europe highlights how quickly our safe havens can be invaded. The student had lived in their quiet neighborhood for years, knowing everyone and never having a single reason to look over their shoulder. Yet, in a matter of seconds, they went from walking home after a fun university event to sprinting for their life from a group of aggressive, unknown men. The agonizing screams they heard beforehand suggest that someone else may have already fallen victim to this group, or that the screams were being used as a sick, manipulative bait to lure helpful neighbors out of their locked homes. The subsequent rock thrown at the house the following night indicates that the threat had not vanished, and that the group may have been monitoring the home, waiting to see if the student was still alone. These stories serve as a powerful and haunting reminder of the importance of situational awareness. We often go through our daily lives on autopilot, listening to music, looking at our phones, and assuming that because we are in a familiar place, we are completely safe. But predators rely on this exact state of distraction. They look for the vulnerable, the unaware, and the isolated. By keeping our eyes open, trusting our instincts when something feels off, and being prepared to defend ourselves or call for help, we can tilt the odds back in our favor. The survivors of these 3 chilling encounters will never look at a dark street, a quiet restroom, or an empty train the same way again, and their experiences serve as a lesson for us all to remain vigilant no matter where we are. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.